There is a trade deal covering 30% of the entire global economy. It governs more than $1.9 trillion in annual commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Donald Trump called it, in his own words, the best and most important trade deal ever made. That deal has 45 days left. On July 1, 2026, all three countries must formally decide whether to extend it for another 16 years. If any one of them declines, the clock starts running toward a hard expiration in 2036. And as of today, formal negotiations between the United States and Canada have been underway for less than 6 weeks. That is not a slow burn. That is a countdown. To understand what is actually at stake on July 1st, you need to understand what the USMCA, called CUSMA in Canada, actually does, and why it was built with a mandatory review. The agreement replaced NAFTA in 2020, and for the first time in the history of North American trade, it included a sunset clause, a built-in expiration mechanism. Under Article 34.7, all three governments must meet every 6 years and confirm in writing that they wish to continue. If they confirm, the agreement runs for another 16 years, and the process repeats. If any party declines to confirm, the USMCA shifts into a cycle of annual reviews. Each year, the parties must assess and recommit, or let the clock tick. After 10 years of annual reviews without resolution, the agreement expires permanently on July 1, 2036. Think of it like a lease on the most important commercial building in North America. Every 6 years, all three tenants have to sign the renewal. If they all sign, they get 16 more years of stability. If even one tenant says, "Not yet, let's talk," the landlord starts charging month to month. And month to month on a relationship means businesses on both sides of every border cannot plan, cannot invest, and cannot hire with confidence. Investment banks and policy analysts call this the uncertainty tax, and it is already being priced in. When Trump returned to the White House and began imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods, many of which directly violated the spirit and letter of the USMCA, he effectively told both neighbors that the deal he had negotiated in his first term was no longer adequate. When Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, told Congress in December 2025 that a rubber stamp of the agreement is not in the national interest, the signal was clear. The United States would use the July 1st review not as a routine renewal, but as a forced renegotiation. Greer's own words, reported by Reuters in April 2026, confirmed that negotiations would extend past the July 1st deadline. That is not a negotiating position. That is an admission that the clock will pass midnight without a deal. Here is where it gets really interesting. Investment bank Jefferies put a number on the probability of a clean USMCA renewal. Their estimate, 10%. 90% probability that July 1st passes without a full 16-year extension. Oxford Economics modeled the case scenario, the one they assigned a 10% probability, in which one or more parties formally decline to extend, tariff exemptions under CUSMA are stripped away, and effective U.S. tariff rates on Canadian and Mexican goods rise sharply. Their conclusion: trade policy uncertainty spikes permanently in Q3 2026, and the effects are not temporary. The reason the stakes are this high is that the USMCA is not just a trade agreement. It is the legal framework that shields most Canadian and Mexican exports from Trump's broader tariff campaign. When Trump imposed his sweeping emergency tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, CUSMA-compliant goods were exempted. That exemption covers more than 90% of Canadian exports to the United States. Strip that exemption away by allowing the USMCA to collapse into annual reviews, and the legal basis for that shield becomes uncertain. Businesses cannot count on it. Contracts cannot be written around it. Supply chains that run across the border, and the automotive industry alone involves components crossing the US-Canada border 8 times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. cannot function without long-term regulatory certainty. And here is something most people missed entirely. The Supreme Court of the United States struck down Trump's IEEPA tariffs in early 2026, ruling that the Emergency Powers Law does not explicitly authorize the president to impose tariffs. Trump responded by announcing a new 10% global tariff designed to replace the IEEPA mechanism. But that ruling also changed the leverage dynamic. It made the USMCA more important, not less, because if the president cannot use IEEPA tariffs freely, the USMCA's own tariff structures become the primary legal architecture governing North American trade. Losing that architecture through expiration would not be a political problem. It would be a structural one. U.S. Trade Representative Greer acknowledged this implicitly when he described certain USMCA provisions as load-bearing pillars worth preserving, even as he demanded changes to the rest. Meanwhile, Canada's formal bilateral talks with the United States had not even begun as of October 2025, when Trump canceled negotiations entirely over an Ontario government television advertisement that criticized the tariffs. Talks did not resume until Janice Charette was installed as Canada's new chief trade negotiator and met Greer in Washington in March 2026. Formal bilateral discussions between the U.S. and Canada began in May 2026. That is 6 weeks before the deadline, on a deal covering $1.9 trillion. There is another angle that almost nobody is talking about. Trump did not cancel USMCA talks with Canada because of the Ontario television ad. That was the stated reason. Trump did not cancel them because he was offended by a provincial government's advertising campaign. He canceled them because cancellation was useful. Every week that Canada and the United States are not formally negotiating is a week in which Canada is operating without certainty, which means Canadian businesses are holding investment, delaying expansion, and deferring hiring decisions. Uncertainty is a tariff you do not have to sign into law. It applies automatically, and the party with more negotiating alternatives can tolerate it longer. This is why Trump's approach to the USMCA review is structurally different from a standard diplomatic negotiation. Standard negotiations involve both parties wanting a deal roughly equally and haggling over terms. What Trump is doing, and the evidence from the CSIS and CFR analyses published in early 2026 is consistent on this point, is using the review mechanism as a perpetual source of leverage. Greer confirmed to a Hudson Institute audience that the U.S. would conduct separate bilateral negotiations with Canada and Mexico, rather than a single trilateral process. That separation is deliberate. It allows Washington to play Ottawa against Mexico City, and to extract concessions from each without either having visibility into what the other is giving up. The issues Washington has put on the table go far beyond standard trade adjustments. U.S. Trade Representative Greer's briefing to congressional committees in December 2025 included demands related to automotive rules of origin, specifically minimum U.S. content thresholds in vehicles, dairy market access, digital trade provisions, and a requirement that Canada and Mexico align their trade policies toward China. That last demand is the most consequential. It would require Canada to adopt restrictions on Chinese investment and goods that align with U.S. policy, effectively asking Canada to choose its economic architecture based on Washington's relationship with Beijing. When Carney met Trump at the White House on May 6, 2026, he committed to a step change in defense spending rather than make concessions on any of those core trade issues. The lumber tariff file stayed open. The dairy file stayed open. The China alignment question stayed open. The clock is running. And the negotiating table has barely been set. Now here is where this starts affecting people who have never heard the word USMCA in their lives. The agreement governs not just finished goods, but the supply chains that make them. The American automotive industry, manufacturing plants in Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama, depends on a production model in which parts cross the U.S.-Canada and U.S.-Mexico borders multiple times before a vehicle is assembled. A single Ford F-150 contains components sourced from suppliers in Windsor, Ontario, Monterrey, Mexico, and dozens of American states. The USMCA's rules of origin determine how much of that vehicle must be made in North America to qualify for zero tariffs. If those rules change abruptly, or if the agreement lapses into annual review uncertainty, automakers cannot sign long-term supplier contracts. They cannot justify plant expansions. They cannot tell workers in Ohio or Michigan whether their jobs will exist in the same form 5 years from now. When Trump announced a 25% tariff on foreign-made vehicles in May 2026, he exempted USMCA-compliant auto parts. For now. That exemption exists because the USMCA exists. A factory worker in Detroit building trucks that depend on Canadian-made components is protected from that tariff precisely because a legal framework says the component is North American, not foreign. Let that framework expire or collapse into annual review uncertainty, and the legal basis for that protection becomes negotiable every 12 months. The Tax Foundation estimated in 2026 that the average American household already pays approximately $1,500 per year in additional costs attributable to the tariff regime. The USMCA's partial exemptions are the reason that number is not higher. If those exemptions become structurally uncertain, the calculation changes for every American who buys a car, a refrigerator, or a piece of furniture with components from across the border. So here's the question. 45 days. $1.9 trillion in annual trade, a deal that covers 30% of global GDP, and formal negotiations between the U.S. and Canada that began 6 weeks before the deadline. Jefferies says there is a 90% chance the clean renewal does not happen by July 1st. Oxford Economics has modeled what the worst-case expiration looks like. CSIS has published 6 scenarios ranging from full renewal to complete collapse. Some will argue this is how Trump negotiates, that the chaos and the deadline pressure are tools, not failures, and that a deal will emerge precisely because the costs of no deal are too high for all 3 parties. The U.S. economy is also exposed. American auto plants, American farms, selling into the Canadian market, American service companies operating across the border. All of them are inside the same framework. Others will argue that when a deal governing nearly $2 trillion in annual commerce reaches its review deadline with 6 weeks of formal negotiations on the clock, calling that a strategy is generous, calling it reckless is more accurate. What do you think happens on July 1st? Does Trump let the clock run, or does a deal get done? Drop your answer below. And if you want to understand what this deadline looks like from Canada's side, what Carney is actually holding, and why he has not blinked, that story is on our partner channel, The Canada Side.